The Saudis have exported more extremist ideology than any other place on earth over the last 30 years. This quote is from Hillary Clinton. However, at the same time, this former Secretary of State authorized the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. And you'll say, really? Well, what a hypocrite. But did you know that bin Laden himself even threatened the Saudi royal house in 2003? It may surprise you, but Saudi Arabia was the first country interested in ending Islamic terrorism, and at the same time, one of its greatest promoters. And I want you to remember this video well, because everything indicates that the story we are going to tell you today could be one of our greatest nightmares for the coming decade. That of the 1920s in the 21st century. So, what is happening in Saudi Arabia? And why should the whole world be concerned? In this video, we are going to tell you. When we think of the Saudis, we think of oil, mountains of money, and the most extravagant luxuries. But what if I told you that this country is actually on the verge of bankruptcy? We've told you 1,000 times here on Visual Politic. Saudi Arabia has been heading for economic collapse for years. Its economy is completely dependent on oil exports. Dinosaur Juice has paid for the whims of Saudi princes, but also for the salaries of almost all of its citizens who work as civil servants. In a way, we could say that the Saudis have lived a utopian dream for decades. To live without hardly working, without paying taxes, and with more than generous salaries. But as oil prices drop, the whole system is coming down. And yes, the coronavirus has been a catalyst for this phenomenon. And I know what many of you are thinking, why should I care? I have enough problems to worry about to be concerned with what's going on in Saudi Arabia. Well, you should be concerned. Very concerned. Much of Saudi society is very prone to embracing radical Islam. In addition, its population is very young, so they have a lot of people old enough to join terrorist groups. The most worrying thing is that Saudi Arabia has the third most expensive and modern military arsenal in the world, only behind the United States and China. Imagine what could happen if all of this fell into the wrong hands. In other words, today, Saudi Arabia is already funding Islamic radicalism around the world. Many Saudi millionaires are paying for radical mosques and schools all over the globe, including Europe and the United States. And the Saudi government doesn't really know how to avoid it. So the question we're asking today is, what is the root of this problem? Why is the solution so difficult? And why might it become our worst nightmare in the years to come? Today, we are going to answer these questions. But first, let's take a look at some history.
The Saudi ideological gap.
In the 18th century, what we know today as Saudi Arabia was a desert controlled by different empires, mainly the Ottoman one. A lot of nomadic Bedouin tribes with more or less power lived in these lands in different territories. One of them was the dynasty of the Sauds, who dominated the territory surrounding modern-day Riyadh. At the time, the Sauds were already very religious. The patriarchs of this dynasty had reached a kind of pact. They would be in charge of military affairs, but the day-to-day affairs would be regulated by the clergy. More specifically, the followers of a very specific theologian, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. And yes, we are talking about the father of what we know today as Salafism. Salafism is a very orthodox interpretation of Islam, and, above all, it's very austere. For example, have you noticed that even today, Saudi princes always wear the same clothes? Take a good look. Beard, tunic, headscarf, and sandals. This attire is not by chance. Salafists must dress according to tradition. Both men and women should be modest. That is to say, they cannot display vanity. And that is why you will rarely see a Saudi Arabian prince wearing a Giorgio Armani suit, even if he has the money to buy as many as he wants. Well, the followers of this theologian were supported by the Saudi nobles, who, as we mentioned, dominated a very small region of what is now Saudi Arabia. However, in the 1930s, all these Arab tribes went to war for control of the entire Arabian Peninsula. The United Kingdom supported the Saudis. With this help, the Royal House of Saud took control of almost the entire peninsula in 1932. And this is how the great Arab nation that we know today as Saudi Arabia, with its first king, was born. In the beginning, this new country was a poor land with nomadic tribes and little more than the desert. But in 1938, things changed forever. That was the year when Saudi Arabia discovered that it was sitting on a whole sea of oil. The US oil companies started to exploit it and, in the process, make agreements with the Saudi royal house. Overnight, this dynasty of nomadic Bedouins became millionaires. On a side note, when we talk about the Saudi royal family, you're probably thinking of a small family. The parents, the children, and a few courtiers, right? Well, look at this. Today, the Saudi royal family is estimated to have about 15,000 members, of whom around 2,000 hold political power and mountains of petrodollars. To give you an idea about how that came about, the first Saudi king, King Abdulaziz bin Saud, had 17 wives and 45 children. Curiously, none of those children has inherited the throne. From 1932 until today, all the kings of this country had been the brothers of this first king. But let's get on with our story. Suddenly, the Saudi princes have become millionaires. And what do you do when you have money literally dripping out of stones? You spend it as if there were no tomorrow.
Damn.
This is when the whole world begins to notice the Arab sheikhs for their most extravagant luxuries, mansions all over the planet, expensive cars, and luxury parties. But wait a minute, didn't we say that Salafism preaches modesty? Well, yes, you're right. And that explains why it is in these years when the great ideological gap begins in Saudi Arabia. While the Saudi royal house was discovering the advantages of being millionaires, the Salafist clerics were criticizing them from their mosques. And so we come to 1979, the year in which this happens.
Mecca 1979, the mosque siege that changed the course of Saudi history. BBC.
Probably very few of you know this story, but it is a turning point in the history of Saudi Arabia. One of the most important mosques in the world is the Great Mosque of Mecca. Well, in 1979, groups of radical Salafists took over this mosque. According to them, the whole country had forgotten its religious roots. More than 50,000 Saudi Arabian army commandos had to enter to free the mosque, and more than 250 people died. By the way, as a side note, I can tell you that this same mosque had been restored by a builder from bin Laden's family. Well, at the time of the attack, the Saudi royal house faced a tremendous moral dilemma. On the one hand, they liked luxury more than anything else, and on the other hand, they themselves believed in the orthodox and austere principles of Salafism. The outcome? Firstly, they paid attention to the most extreme demands of the religious. That's when they brought out laws like the one that forbade women to drive. But secondly, they kept living their lifestyle to the max. In fact, a year later in 1980 was when the nationalization of Aramco, the Saudi oil company, was completed. At that time, the Saudi royal house was making more money than ever, and that's when we enter the period of
the double standard.
Now, the question that I'm sure many of you have pondered is, what would you do if you suddenly started making billions of dollars as if there were no tomorrow? Well, the Saudi royal house has the answer. Spend all of that money on the craziest luxuries that you can imagine. For example, one of those 2,000 Saudi princes had a custom Mercedes made, covered entirely with diamonds. Others, however, preferred to spend their cash on other things, such as political and religious influence. And that's why, starting in the 1970s, many of these Saudi billionaires began giving money to charity. These charities have built Salafist schools and mosques throughout the Islamic world, and the non-Islamic one too. Today, there are Salafist mosques in practically every country. What began as a minority religious denomination is becoming a widely accepted belief. It is gaining ground in places as disparate as Dagestan or Chechnya, as well, of course, as Muslim communities in countries like France. And as you know, we're not just talking about religion. Many of these Salafist mosques not only discuss religion, but they also promote terrorism. Today, we can say that much of the money that was used to plan September 11 came from Saudi millionaires. But hold on a minute, because the United States is not the only enemy of the Salafist terrorists. In fact, their worst enemy is what they consider false Salafists. Bin Laden himself launched messages against the Saudi royal house, and in 2008, the Saudi Arabian government signed an agreement with the White House to fight terrorism. Since then, Saudi Arabia has come to create its own centers of de-radicalization. In these centers, Islamic radicals conduct art therapy sessions, group dynamics, and all kinds of treatments very similar to those used to treat drug addiction. The effectiveness of these treatments is debatable, to say the least. Meanwhile, the United States has sent advisors, shared intelligence, and sold all kinds of weapons to Saudi Arabia. And you're probably thinking, hang on, what's with all this weaponry? Well, in many cases, things like this happen.
The US shipped weapons and secrets to the Saudis and Emiratis. Now, some of these are in the hands of fighters linked to Al-Qaeda and Iran. CNN.
At this point, some may think that all this is because Saudi Arabia does not want to end terrorism. But what if it boiled down to simple inefficiency? Think about it. The Saudi royal family has 2,000 princes with money and royal power. So much money and power that they can afford to live on the fringes of government. Do you really think society is so easy to control? Well, not really. In fact, for the moment, the only strategy that has allowed the Saudi monarchs to control their society is this.
The Saudi social contract.
To better understand how society works in Saudi Arabia, let's look at this chart. The working population represents 59% of the country. So far, so good. Well, more than half of those workers are immigrants. The other half are Saudi nationals. Well, of these national workers, more than 70% are civil servants. That's right. Practically all Saudi citizens work for the government under superb conditions, an average salary of between $3,000 and $4,000 practically tax-free. In addition, most of their expenses are subsidized. That includes housing. And of course, in most cases, Saudi officials do not even have to comply with working hours. In other words, the Saudi social contract is very simple. You turn a blind eye to all the luxuries of the Saudi royal house, and in return, we allow you to live in utopia. This strategy became even more evident in 2011. Like the rest of the Muslim countries, Saudi Arabia also had its own particular Arabian Spring, with protests in the streets. So how did the government respond? Simple. The king launched a $93 billion spending package comprising public housing and new civil service positions. And how do you pay for all this when you barely charge any taxes? You know the answer: dinosaur juice. Oil has financed a real economic utopia. Meanwhile, the Saudi royal house has bought the most modern weaponry on the planet. Fighter planes, tanks, and everything else that you can imagine. The Saudi Arabian army is the third most expensive army in the world. In 2017, Trump authorized $110 billion in arms sales. To give you an idea, this figure is roughly equivalent to Morocco's entire GDP. Well, over the next 7 years, the Saudi royal house is going to spend all this money on armaments. And you will say, why is the United States so interested in selling arms to this country? The idea is that, with so much weaponry, Saudi Arabia can fight terrorism. In fact, in 2015, Riyadh created a whole military coalition against terrorism, a kind of anti-terrorist NATO that includes almost all Muslim countries, all except Iran, of course. However, we return to our original point. How can you control all those 2,000 princes of the Saudi royal house? Many of them are the first ones to finance terrorism, but at the same time, they are part of the elite that governs the country. However, this is not Saudi Arabia's biggest problem. The biggest problem in this country is that this Saudi social pact is about to be broken, because the price of oil is no longer what it used to be. Fewer and fewer petrodollars are entering the country, and everything points to this being a continuing trend in the coming decades. Well, in 2017, the solution to all these problems had a name of its own. Listen up.
The Great Saudi Disappointment.
Since 2017, Mohammed bin Salman has been the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. That is, when his father, King Salman, dies, he will inherit the throne. But until that day comes, he already has full powers to run the country. Think about it. Bin Salman is 35 years old. His father is 84. The objective of this young prince is to succeed in diversifying the Saudi Arabian economy. In other words, this Saudi social pact will no longer depend on the price of oil. That, he needs to create new economic sectors, and that explains all the mega projects that we have talked about in previous Visual Politic videos. But not only that, do you remember those 2,000 members of the Saudi royal house? Well, many of them are not at all happy to be directed by a 35-year-old boy, much less with hearing about modernization in their country. And that's why, from the first day that bin Salman took power, he decided to strike.
How Saudi elite became 5-star prisoners at the Riyadh Ritz-Carlton. Telegraph.
Exactly! Bin Salman didn't even break a sweat when he launched anti-corruption raids across the country. In 3 years, he's shown everyone who is in charge of this country. In other words, Saudi Arabia has gone from having a quasi-tribal political system to becoming a one-person dictatorship. This also explains the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and many other activists. These are all attempts by bin Salman to consolidate his power. Many of these actions are real monstrosities. However, the White House has turned a blind eye. Why? Because, at least in theory, thanks to these movements, bin Salman can control the most radical religious leaders. And here is where the dilemma lies. Which is better? Do we accept that bin Salman becomes a dictator in exchange for Saudi Arabia stopping the export of terrorism? Well, yes, it could be a major ethical dilemma, but don't worry, you can stop wondering. Reality has already given us the answer. Bin Salman is failing miserably. The clearest example is in the Yemen War. Saudi Arabia has the most modern weaponry in the world. Yemeni rebels, supported by Iran, use Soviet Union weaponry. In principle, this war would seem like a military tour de force. However, the Yemen War has become a humanitarian drama, and a complete humiliation for Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, in the field of economics, Bin Salman has applied the recipes of the Swedish chef. We have explained it in many other videos that I'll link for you in the description. The Aramco IPO was a failure, and almost no investor has dared to take a gamble on the Saudi megacities. You know, those megacities that were going to have flying cars, Jurassic Parks, and artificial moons to attract tourism. To all this, we must add the coronavirus crisis, which has acted as a catalyst. Meanwhile, Bin Salman is depleting foreign reserve currencies and increasing the country's debt. At the same time, youth unemployment in Saudi Arabia is already at 27%. Think about it. With a state on the verge of bankruptcy, is it possible to hire more officials? At the same time all of this was happening, Bin Salman bought one of the most expensive yachts in the world, a luxury yacht worth more than $500 million. In addition, he has a $300 million French castle and a $450 million Da Vinci painting. In other words, more and more young people are going onto unemployment benefits. Meanwhile, despite Bin Salman's efforts, there are still plenty of radical imams preaching their ideas on social networks. Some, like Muhammad Al-Arif, have over 20 million followers on Twitter. This man is banned from countries such as Switzerland, Denmark, and the United Kingdom. However, he still works at King Saud University. The Saudi government has tried to stop him on several occasions, and in each of these attempts, thousands of supporters took to the streets to defend him. To top it off, remember the enormous arsenal that the Saudi army has? And here's where we have some questions for you. What would happen if all those weapons fell into the wrong hands? What would happen if the Saudi social contract was definitively broken? What would happen if all those Saudi citizens lost their jobs? Leave your answers down in the comments. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did. And don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. As always, I'll see you in the next video.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.